Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. Welcome to Doc's Lab and our second Master Series. I do believe this is the 102nd video in our second Master Series, the 51st video on our basic processors, the 14th video on sculpting processors, the 4th video on noise, and in this video we're going to look at applying noise with gates and expanders. So really quickly, we're not going to get into the gates and expanders. Those are processors we're going to look at later on in this series, but there are some videos on my channel about them for you to take a look at. The biggest concept you have to understand is that if you look at this from here that goes through to about there, that's an envelope. And from here, going all the way across here, is another envelope, which makes it very hard to follow with a gate or expander unless you have a real elaborate envelope shaper, which you can look into them, but you might spend a whole lot of time messing with that rather than just using your automation. Because basically what we're looking at here is if you look at something like the ADSR, the attack, decay, sustain, and release, is what we're looking at as the envelope of sound. But sometimes that it's not this simple. It becomes really complicated like this, something like you seeing, here. It's going all over the place. There's not some real simple envelope of sound. So it makes it kind of difficult. There are some videos that explain compressors, limiters, expanders, and gates on my channel that you're going to want to take a look at, but basically the concept is pretty simple. What we want to do is we have this set up like this. We've got a gate and expander on here, and I'll show you the gate first and we'll even listen to it. That basically what's happening is you've got, you're going to want to read about your gates and expanders, but to get a little bit better understanding, experiment with them, but you're basically wanting to try to follow the envelope sound a little bit. But it really comes down to more, it's going to open and then it's going to close. And you can set the ratio on an expander where it closes faster or lighter and things like that. And sometimes you can address that sometimes a little bit with your attack and release. But the understanding of it is trying to open up at a certain area and drop out at a certain area so you don't have as much control. So gates and expanders are great sometimes if you're applying noise to things that are farther back in the mix or things that it's not real obvious, that you can bring the noise up a little bit and it's not, you're doing analog saturation or something like that, and it's not quite so delicate. Because basically what you end up with, like if I have the gate here, that I've got it set to where it's opening up about -18 dB and it's closing about the same also. So when it goes up above that, it's letting it open. It goes down, it hits it, it's starting to close it, and the range is -72. It means it hits 0 and it drops out or it drops down, I want it to crush so there's no noise happening in any of these dropout areas. And then my attack and release, you got this attack and then you've got a release coming off it. I've set it to where it's about 30 milliseconds and 30 milliseconds, because basically as it hits a certain point, say -18 dB, how it's going to open it up gradually over 30 milliseconds, and the same is, so it's not quite so aggressive, it just open up immediately. It's more of an angle coming, it causes more of an angle of it coming in, just like it is normally with an envelope. But you can experiment to where it follows the coming in and dropping out a little bit more detail. And with the expander, it's a little bit different because you'll end up having what is basically, it's about the same. You've got the threshold there to where it'll start letting, before it starts to crush it below that, you've got a range about the same where I've got it all the way down so it just crushes any sound out there. But it's got a ratio. So the ratio will let you do a little bit more smooth that's kind of augmenting the attack and release. And I'll show you because we'll look at both those. Let me turn down my microphone and I'll just I'll show you so you can hear. As I go through it, I'm going to turn it on with the gate and then you're going to hear the noise there And then I'm going to drop the noise down to where I think it would probably be for just doing this analog emulation with white and pink noise. Then I'll do the same thing with expander. When I do the expander, I'll fuss with the ratio a little bit to give you a little bit better understanding of that. The biggest concept you have to get in your head here is it can be different with different instruments. Instruments that have a really fast attack and release, instruments that have a slower attack and release, and vocals, things like that are usually the most difficult, that you basically just gotta have to fuss with. You have to experiment around with the parameters until you can get a nice flow happening. But most of the time, luckily, noise is pretty delicate application, so it's not really aggressive, so you sometimes don't have to worry about it that much, which sometimes why you can use a gate or an expander when applying, especially to things that are a little bit farther back in the mix. So let's take a listen to this, put on our headphones, and listen to what it sounds like as we adjust it into what it should be for the mix, just to be analog warmth. It can be the same for when you're doing sculpting and things like that. I'm going to turn down my mic while we do this. Do your magic, make me sound good. 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 Now you can see as I come around there that it's having the same effect. The expander works a little bit differently, and you could tell that when I bring this expander all the way in here, this ratio like this, it's more like a gate. It's more akin to now it's set up almost like the gate is set up. But as it's giving me this extra parameter so I can have a little bit softer ratio coming in there where it's all the way up there, it's like a gate. Bam, 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 bam. Does that make sense? Whereas with this ratio softening up, it's got less, it's hitting it softer. Does that make sense? And it's pretty obvious my threshold, how far my threshold is there. And also you have a range with an expander. So if you don't have the range all the way down, you've got a difference between when it comes out, any noise down in here won't get squished. It'll just squish it between here and here. Does that make sense? And anything below there, it won't squish it. So that's another thing about the expander you got to be watch out for. It's a little bit different than the gate. So you drop that range all the way down there. The gate gives you some of that same kind of, that same thing, but in my humble opinion, it doesn't quite work exactly the same way as an expander, but fairly similar. The application is a little bit different. Once we get into those processors later, we'll look at that. The biggest thing you're going to want to worry about is this ratio that can give you a little bit more control to make it a little bit smooth, how when it's pushing it down and letting it up, how, you know, whether it's bam, you know, because your attack and release, you know, whether you got the gate or expander, it's about the same, you know, on either one of them. But the ratio, it can augment that to give you a little bit more control. So both of these applications, very simply, can help out a lot, because you can basically drop that noise down to the level that I had it, and it's pretty light. Does that make sense? So you're still adding that saturation in there. It's opening up when the vocal starts at a certain point. I've got it set at like -18 here, and then it's when it starts to drop down below that, it's closing it off, and the attack and release of that are set. That way, that it's not as much control as automation, but when you drop it down to the noise, to the level you're going to probably have it at when you're adding, you know, saturation or something like that, and sometimes even sculpting sound noise, that it's going to function okay for it. Because you have to take into consideration it's still going to blend with the mix, so, and you can always adjust it later if it's too much or not enough or whatever, or something like that. So get a ballpark figure of how it sounds good all by itself, and then adjust it later. So because now that you have a little bit easier tool to work with, you don't have to draw out your automation, do all that. You can set up a gate or expander to do this quite easily, and then just, you know, adjust the level of your event and let it ride. You might come to some areas to where it's like, no, well, that's fine for this segment, but in this other segment, you know, I want a little bit more because the way the vocals are. This other segment, I want it down a little bit. Does that make sense? So you got a little bit more control there. In some areas, you might want a little bit more aggressive than in other areas. And you can control it right there from the event without messing with the gate, because all I have this sent from here on here, I've got to send this side chain that's coming in from that track. So I've side chained it into the gate and into the expander, side chaining from coming into this track from here. So the actual gate is on the noise track, and so is the expander, but it's side chained in from the track that I'm putting noise on. So it's a pretty simple procedure. It's not like it's really complicated, or you got to sit there and it's going to be, you know, you're going to spend the biggest thing you're going to come to. We'll get into expanders and gates later, and there are some videos on my channel about it, but just getting used to trying to work the envelope as best you can with the simple tools that you have, because all you have is you got to open and a close, a range, an attack and release, and a hold to try to contour the incoming signal from the side chain to allow the noise to, you know, voice, you know, in contour with whatever sound that you side chained in. That is, you've got a little bit more control with the expander and the ratio control that you have there, but it's still, don't get frustrated like it doesn't just follow the exact envelope of sound like when you do an automation, because it probably won't. You know, you might be able to get it really close, like a drum hit or a snare hit. Bam, bam, bam. You can probably set up a gate or an expander to follow it pretty dang close, you know, if you spend some time. When you're doing vocals or a violin, you know, or something, or a cello, you know, or your synth patch, it might not follow it exactly the way you want. So you might want to look into an envelope shaper, but I think you might be spending way too much time trying to follow that envelope of sound, when you could just, if it's that detailed and it's that important to where it's just, you know, it has to be that delicate of work, that use your automation. But when it's farther back in the mix and you're just trying to add a little bit of saturation, you know, the analog warmth or a little bit of saturation on that track, you know, you know, that's okay. You can probably get away with it with your gate or expander. And, or, you know, when you're doing your sound sculpting on things a little farther back in the mix, that it doesn't have to be quite so, you know, contoured to the sound, because it's not like it's an out front vocal or something like that that's everything is noticeable. I mean, it's something a little bit farther back in the mix that's blending a lot more with the things that are going on in the mix. So, and plus it's going to have a blending effect anyway. Just be careful, and when you set it the way you want it, you can always go back and readjust it later as you go through the sculpting processors to readjust it a little bit. And when you get into subgroup mixing and mixing, you might readjust it again because of its impact on the whole. So I hope that made that very simple, and this video doesn't have a whole lot of stuff going on. It's a really simple video for this Friday night to just kind of get you trying to work that a little bit. Plus, you'll get a little bit better understanding of your gate and expander, and side chaining like this. It's kind of cool, and you might even mess around and find some way to duck it. You know, if you got a ducking option, you might be able to reverse that process and try to apply it with that. But I wouldn't mess with it too much. We should do a pretty good job, and you have to just kind of experiment around a little bit to get a little bit better understanding of your parameters, a little bit more comfortable with them, and start practicing and applying and experimenting. So peace, hope, love. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, and I will see you in the next one.